The rope scratched against her neck as they dragged her up the courthouse steps. The entire town of Millfield had gathered to watch Cassandra Cass Williams die. What they didn't know was that 20 miles away, Jake Morrison was already riding hard with his gang, and every hoofbeat brought them closer to a reckoning that would turn their quiet frontier town into a battlefield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millfield, Texas, but Cass Williams wasn't thinking about the weather as Sheriff Harold Blackwood shoved her roughly toward the wooden platform they'd hastily constructed overnight. Her hands were bound behind her back with coarse rope that had already begun to chafe her wrists raw. The crowd that had gathered was unlike anything the small cattle town had ever seen. Nearly every soul within 50 miles had come to witness what they were calling justice. Cass kept her chin high as she climbed each wooden step, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. At 19, she had the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words and women whisper behind their fans. Auburn hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her green eyes held a defiance that hadn't dimmed even as the noose swayed in. The morning breeze above her head, Judge Cornelius Hartford stood on the platform in his black robes, sweating despite the cool October air. He was a thin man, with nervous hands, and a reputation for harsh sentences, but even he seemed uncomfortable with what was about to happen. The territorial governor had made it clear that examples needed to be made of those who aided outlaws, and Cass Williams had become that example. Citizens of Millfield and surrounding territories, Judge Hartford's voice cracked as he addressed the crowd. We are gathered here to carry out the sentence of death by hanging for one Cassandra Williams, found guilty of providing aid and comfort to known criminals, specifically the outlaw Jake Morrison and his gang. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed satisfaction. These were the merchants and landowners who had suffered losses to Morrison's raids. Others looked troubled, particularly the women who knew Cass from church or from her work at the general store. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who had taught Cass to read when she was 7, stood near the front with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The charges against Cass were serious by frontier standards, but everyone in town knew the real story was more complicated than what had been presented in court. It had all started 6 months earlier when Jake Morrison first rode into Millfield. Jake wasn't like the other outlaws who occasionally passed through their territory. He was educated, well-spoken, and carried himself with the bearing of a gentleman. Despite the Colt .45 that never left his hip, he'd grown up on a ranch in Kansas before his family lost everything to a corrupt banker and a rigged foreclosure. That betrayal had set him on the outlaw trail, but he'd never lost the manners his mother had drilled into him as a boy. Cass first met him when he came into Patterson's general store where she worked. She was reaching for a bolt of fabric on a high shelf when he appeared beside her, easily retrieving what she couldn't reach. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that neither could explain or ignore. "Thank you, sir," she had said, accepting the fabric. "Jake Morrison, miss, and the pleasure was entirely mine." She should have recognized the name. Jake Morrison's gang had been robbing banks and trains across 3 territories for the better part of 2 years. But standing there in the afternoon, sunlight streaming through the store windows, he just looked like a handsome cowboy with kind hazel eyes and a smile that made her forget her own name. Their courtship, if it could be called that, took place in stolen moments over the following weeks. Jake would find reasons to come to town, always carefully, always watching for the law. They would meet behind the old mission church after Sunday services, or sometimes by the creek that ran behind her boarding house. He told her about his family's ranch, about the books he'd read, about his dreams of someday having enough money to buy land in California where no one knew his name. Cass fell in love not with an outlaw, but with the man Jake might have been under different circumstances. She saw past the reputation to someone who had been forced into a life he never wanted. In those quiet moments by the creek, with the cottonwoods rustling overhead, she could almost forget that he was wanted dead or alive across half the frontier. The trouble started when Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett arrived in Millfield. Garrett was ambitious and ruthless, known for bringing in outlaws dead more often than alive. He'd been tracking Morrison's gang for months and had reason to believe they were operating somewhere in the area. Garrett was a big man with cold blue eyes and a mustache that he kept waxed to sharp points. He took rooms above the saloon and immediately began questioning everyone in town about suspicious strangers. His methods were thorough and intimidating. Within a week, several townspeople had mentioned seeing Cass talking to a man who matched Morrison's description. The deputy marshal set up surveillance on Cass, following her movements and watching her routine. It didn't take long for him to confirm his suspicions. On a Thursday evening in late September, he followed her to the old Mission Church and witnessed her meeting with Jake Morrison. Garrett could have arrested Morrison that night, but he was smart enough to know that Jake would never be taken alive if he saw trouble coming. Instead, the deputy marshal chose a different strategy. He would use Cass as bait to draw Morrison into a trap. The next morning, Garrett arrived at Patterson's general store with two other lawmen. They arrested Cass in front of a store full of customers, making sure word would spread quickly throughout the territory. The charges were harboring a fugitive and providing aid to known criminals, both hanging offenses under territorial law. "You're making a mistake," Cass had said as they cuffed her hands behind her back. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Meeting secretly with Jake Morrison isn't wrong?" Garrett's voice was mocking. "Passing information about law enforcement movements isn't wrong? You've been helping that outlaw stay one step ahead of justice, Miss Williams, and now you're going to pay the price." The accusations weren't entirely false. Cass had warned Jake when she heard talk of posses being formed, or when she noticed strangers asking questions around town. She'd also occasionally passed along supplies, food, ammunition, medicine for wounded gang members. In her mind, she was protecting the man she loved. In the eyes of the law, she was an accomplice to robbery and murder. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Judge Hartford had been appointed specifically to clean up lawlessness in the territory, and he was under pressure from wealthy cattlemen and railroad interests to make examples of anyone connected to outlaw activity. Cass's court-appointed lawyer, a nervous young man named Peter Caldwell, who had never handled a capital case, was no match for the territorial prosecutor. The evidence against her was circumstantial, but damning. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing her with Morrison. A search of her room had turned up a letter in Jake's handwriting, not incriminating in its contents, but proof of their relationship. Most damaging was the testimony of Samuel Fletcher, a traveling merchant who claimed to have overheard Cass warning Morrison about a planned posse. Fletcher was lying, motivated by a reward offered for information leading to Morrison's capture, but his testimony was convincing. Cass's lawyer tried to challenge his credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in his story, but Judge Hartford seemed determined to move the case along quickly. The verdict came after less than an hour of deliberation, guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out 3 days later to allow time for word to spread. Judge Hartford hoped that news of the execution would draw Morrison out of hiding, either to attempt a rescue or to seek revenge. Either way, Deputy Marshal Garrett would be ready. Now, as Cass stood on the platform with the noose being fitted around her neck, she wondered if Jake even knew what was happening. The gang had been laying low since her arrest, and there had been no attempts at communication. Part of her hoped he would stay away, that he would save himself rather than risk his life and the lives of his men for her. But another part of her, the part that had fallen in love with his fierce loyalty and protective nature, knew he would never abandon her. The crowd had grown restless as Judge Hartford read through the formal charges one final time. Children had been lifted onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view, and vendors moved through the crowd selling roasted nuts and hard candy. To many of the spectators, this was entertainment as much as justice. Cassandra Williams, Judge Hartford's voice carried across the square, "You have been found guilty of providing aid and comfort to enemies of the law. Do you have any final words before the sentence is carried out?" Cass looked out over the sea of faces, some hostile, some curious, some genuinely sorrowful. She thought about what she wanted to say, about whether she should beg for mercy or proclaim her innocence one last time. Instead, she chose honesty. "I love Jake Morrison," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the rope around her neck. "I won't apologize for that. Love isn't always convenient or safe, but it's the most honest thing any of us can do. If that's worth dying for, then so be it." Her words sent another murmur through the crowd. Some nodded in understanding, while others shook their heads in disgust. Deputy Marshal Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun as he scanned the crowd and the surrounding buildings. He was expecting trouble, hoping for it even. Morrison's gang was worth a fortune in bounty money, and Garrett intended to collect every penny. The executioner, a hooded man brought in from Austin specifically for this purpose, adjusted the rope one final time and stepped toward the lever that would spring the trapdoor. Judge Hartford raised his hand, preparing to give the final signal. That's when the first gunshot rang out from the hills overlooking the town. It wasn't the sharp crack of a rifle or the boom of a scattered volley. It was a single, precise shot that sent Judge Hartford's hat spinning off his head and skittering across the wooden platform. The crowd immediately began to panic, people shoving and pushing as they tried to get away from what they suddenly realized might become a battlefield. "Morrison!" Deputy Marshal Garrett shouted, drawing his weapon and turning in a circle as he tried to locate the source of the shot. "I know you're out there!" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second shot answered him, splintering the wooden rail inches from where he stood. This one came from a different direction, from the cluster of buildings on the east side of town. Garrett realized with a growing alarm that they were surrounded. Through the dust and chaos, a voice carried clear and strong across the town square. "Let her go, Garrett! This is between you and me!" Jake Morrison sat his horse on the ridge overlooking Millfield, silhouetted against the morning sky like something out of a dime novel. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking his tall frame and the confident way he sat his saddle. But he wasn't alone. Spread out along the ridge and positioned throughout the town were the dark shapes of armed riders, 20 men, just as the title promised. Each one a hardened outlaw with nothing to lose and everything to gain from a successful rescue. They had income not just for Jake's woman, but because every man in that gang understood that if the law could hang a woman for loving an outlaw, none of them would ever be safe. The showdown that would determine Cass Williams's fate and the future of Millfield, Texas, was about to begin. Deputy Marshal Garrett's mind raced as he calculated the odds. 20 outlaws against him, Sheriff Blackwood, and maybe a dozen townsmen who could handle a gun. The mathematics of survival weren't in his favor, but surrender wasn't in his vocabulary. He'd built his reputation on bringing down men like Morrison, and he wasn't about to let that reputation die in some dusty Texas town. "You've got 30 seconds to release the woman," Jake's voice echoed from the ridge, calm and measured despite the circumstances. "After that, we start shooting, and we don't stop until she's free or we're all dead." Garrett grabbed Cass roughly by the arm, using her as a human shield as he backed toward the courthouse steps. "You come down here alone, Morrison, and maybe we can make a deal. But if any of your boys so much as twitch wrong, the girl dies right here." The crowd had largely scattered by now, taking cover behind wagons, in doorways, anywhere they could find protection from what was clearly going to become a war zone. But some remained, pressed against building walls or crouched behind water troughs, too fascinated by the unfolding drama to flee completely. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson hadn't moved from her spot near the platform. The elderly woman stood with her, hands clasped in front of her, lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. She had known Cass since childhood, had watched her grow from a spirited little girl into a beautiful young woman. The idea of that same girl dying on a gallows for the crime of falling in love was more than her conscience could bear. 30 seconds are up, Garrett, Jake called out. This time his voice came from a different location entirely. While everyone had been focused on the ridge, he had somehow moved closer to town without being detected. The man was like a ghost when he needed to be. Garrett spun around, trying to locate Morrison's new position, but the echo off the surrounding hills made it impossible to pinpoint. That's when he realized just how thoroughly outmaneuvered he'd been. Morrison's gang wasn't just positioned randomly around the town. They had specific assignments, specific fields of fire, and they had probably been in position for hours before making their presence known. The first shot came from Tommy, Red Sullivan, positioned behind the grain elevator on the north side of town. Red was Jake's second in command, a former cavalry sergeant who had deserted after watching his unit massacre a peaceful Cheyenne village. His rifle skills were legendary among the outlaw community, and his shot took Deputy Marshal Garrett's hat clean off his head without so much as grazing his scalp. "Next one won't miss," Red's voice carried across the distance. "Let the lady go." Garrett's response was to press his Colt 45 harder against Cass's temple. "I've got 20 men positioned around this town too, Morrison. Texas Rangers, deputy. Marshals, bounty hunters, they've been waiting for you to show yourself. You ride out now, and maybe some of your boys live to see tomorrow." It was a bluff, and not a particularly good one. If Garrett had possessed that kind of backup, he would have used it already. Jake Morrison was too experienced to fall for such obvious misdirection, but he played along anyway. "Show them to me," Jake challenged. "Have them step out where we can see them. If you've got 20 men, prove it." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. The only sounds were the distant whinnying of horses and the creak of the gallows rope swaying in the breeze. Finally, Sheriff Blackwood stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Garrett, this has gone far enough," Blackwood said. His voice was tired, the voice of a man who had seen too much violence in his 57 years. "I've been sheriff of this town for 12 years, and I've never seen anything good come from this kind of standoff. Let the girl go, and maybe we can all walk away from this." "Stay out of this, Blackwood," Garrett snarled. "This is federal business now. I'm taking Morrison dead or alive, and if that means the girl dies too, so be it." That's when Jake Morrison finally showed himself. He rode slowly down the main street of Millfield, his hands clearly visible on his saddle horn, his rifle secured in its scabbard. But even unarmed, there was something about him that commanded attention. He sat on his horse like he owned the world, and his hazel eyes never left Garrett's face. "Here I am," Jake said simply. "Now let her go." "Not that easy, outlaw," Garrett replied. "You dismount, throw down your weapons, and surrender yourself to federal custody. Then maybe we will talk about the girl." Jake swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, his boots hitting the dusty street without a sound. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall, then pulled a hidden knife from his boot and tossed it aside as well. But even disarmed, he didn't look defeated. If anything, he looked more dangerous than before. "Weapons down," Jake announced loudly enough for his men to hear. "Nobody shoots unless I'm dead." The gesture sent a clear message to both sides. Jake Morrison was willing to sacrifice himself for Cassandra Williams. But if Garrett killed him, There would be hell to pay from 19 very angry outlaws positioned throughout the town. Garrett seemed to understand the implication. Killing Morrison now would result in his own death within seconds, along with the deaths of most of the townspeople caught in the crossfire. But he also knew that letting Morrison go would end his career in federal law enforcement. He was caught between two impossible choices. "Smart play, Morrison," Garrett said, "but not smart enough. See, I know something you don't know." Jake's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" "Your woman here isn't just guilty of helping outlaws. She's carrying information about a government gold shipment, $20,000 in federal gold being moved from Austin to El Paso next week. Information she got from you, information she was planning to sell to other outlaw gangs." It was a lie, a desperate fabrication designed to justify what Garrett was about to do. But it was delivered with such conviction that even some of the townspeople began to look at Cass with suspicion. "That's not true." Cass spoke for the first time since Jake's arrival. Her voice was steady, despite the gun at her head. "I never heard anything about any gold shipment. Jake never told me about his business." "Course you'd deny it," Garrett said, "but I've got witnesses who heard you talking about it. Ain't that right, Fletcher?" Samuel Fletcher, the traveling merchant who had testified against Cass at trial, stepped out from behind the hotel across the street. He looked nervous but determined, probably thinking about the reward money that would come from corroborating Garrett's story. "That's right, Marshal," Fletcher called out. "Heard her talking about government gold with my own ears. $20,000. She said, moving through Millfield next Tuesday." The lie was getting more elaborate by the minute, but Jake wasn't buying it. He had been careful never to discuss gang business with Cass, partly to protect her, and partly to protect his men's operational security. Besides, there was no government gold shipment. Jake's sources would have told him about anything that was valuable moving through their territory. "You're lying, Garrett," Jake said calmly, "and we both know it. This is about you wanting to make a name for yourself by bringing me in. The girl's just bait, and you're willing to murder her to get—" "To me, maybe so," Garrett admitted, "but it doesn't change the facts. She's a convicted criminal, sentenced to hang under territorial law. I'm just carrying out the court's decision." That's when Mrs. Eleanor Patterson finally found her voice. The elderly woman stepped forward, her weathered hands shaking, but her voice strong with righteous anger. "Thomas Garrett," she said. "I've known this girl since she was 7 years old. I taught her to read from my own Bible and watched her grow up in this town. She's never stolen so much as a penny candy from the general store, never told a lie. That wasn't meant to spare someone's feelings. If you think she's some kind of criminal mastermind trafficking in government secrets, then you're either a fool or a liar." Her words carried weight in the community. Mrs. Patterson was one of the founding families of Millfield, a woman whose word was trusted absolutely. Several other townspeople began to nod in agreement, and Garrett could see his support evaporating. "Doesn't matter what you people think," Garrett said. "Law is law, and the law says she hangs." "Whose law?" The voice came from an unexpected source, Judge Cornelius Hartford himself. The thin man had been standing silently on the gallows platform since the shooting started, but now he stepped forward with surprising authority. "I beg your pardon?" Garrett was clearly taken aback. "I asked whose law," Judge Hartford repeated. "Because the law I swore to uphold is supposed to be about justice, not revenge, and nothing about this feels like justice to me." The judge's intervention changed the entire dynamic of the standoff. Hartford had been the one to sentence Cass to death, but now he seemed to be having second thoughts about the wisdom of that decision. "Your Honor," Garrett said carefully, "the woman was tried and convicted according to territorial statute. The sentence was legally imposed." "Based on perjured testimony and manufactured evidence," Hartford replied. "Yes, Marshal, I may be old, but I'm not blind. I've seen enough trials to recognize when witnesses are lying for money." "Samuel Fletcher," They couldn't keep his story straight if his life depended on it. Fletcher's face went pale at the judge's words. He began backing away from the street, clearly realizing that his lies were about to catch up with him. The conviction stands, Garrett insisted, but his voice had lost some of its authority. Actually, Judge Hartford said, I'm not sure it does. See, I've been thinking about this case ever since the verdict came in, and I've got some serious concerns about the legal proceedings, concerns that might warrant a new trial or even a dismissal of charges. Jake Morrison had been watching this exchange with growing hope, but he was too experienced to trust in legal technicalities. Judges could change their minds again just as easily, and Garrett still had a gun to Cass's head. Interesting conversation, Jake said, but it doesn't solve our immediate problem. Garrett, you've got two choices. Let her go now, or explain to your superiors why you started a war in a civilian town over a woman you knew was innocent. She's not innocent, Garrett snarled, but his conviction was wavering. Maybe not, Jake conceded. Maybe she did help me. From time to time, maybe she did warn me when posses were forming or when strangers came asking questions, but that makes her guilty of loving someone, not of being a criminal mastermind. And last I checked, love wasn't a hanging offense. The standoff had reached a crucial moment. Garrett could feel the situation slipping away from him, could sense that the townspeople were turning against him, but his pride and his reputation wouldn't let him simply back down. He needed a way to save face while getting out of this alive. That's when Sheriff Blackwood provided him with an unexpected lifeline. Marshal Garrett, Blackwood said formally, as the duly elected sheriff of Millfield County, I'm placing you under arrest for threatening the life of a civilian during a disputed legal proceeding. The sheriff's announcement stunned everyone, including Garrett himself. Blackwood had been largely silent during the confrontation, but now he was asserting his local authority over federal jurisdiction. You can't arrest a federal marshal, Garrett protested. Watch me, Blackwood replied, drawing his own weapon. This is my town, my county, and my jurisdiction. And in my jurisdiction, we don't execute women based on lies and manufactured evidence. The tide had completely turned now. Garrett found himself facing not just Jake Morrison's gang, but the local law enforcement and the town's leading citizens. As well, he was outnumbered, outgunned, and rapidly running out of options. But Thomas Garrett hadn't survived 15 years in federal law enforcement by giving up easily. If he was going down, he was taking Jake Morrison with him. Garrett's finger tightened on the trigger of his Colt 45, the metal cold against Cass's temple. His eyes darted between Jake Morrison standing unarmed in the street, Sheriff Blackwood with his weapon drawn, and the surrounding buildings where he knew Morrison's gang waited like wolves in the shadows. Nobody moves, Garrett commanded, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. I'll kill her right here, right now, and then we'll see how brave you outlaws really are. Jake's hands remained steady at his sides, but his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. He had faced down lawmen, rival gangs, and angry townspeople, but he had never felt as helpless as he did in this moment. The woman he loved was seconds away from death, and any wrong move on his part would seal her fate. Thomas, Sheriff Blackwood said quietly, using Garrett's first name deliberately. Think about what you're doing. You kill that girl, and you become a murderer yourself. Is that really how you want your career to end? My career ended the moment Morrison showed up with his army, Garrett replied bitterly. But I'll be damned if I let him ride out of here a free man. High above on the ridge, Tommy Red Sullivan had his rifle trained on Garrett's head, but he couldn't take the shot. The deputy marshal was positioned too close to Cass, and even Red's legendary marksmanship couldn't guarantee her safety at this distance. All he could do was wait and hope that Jake had a plan. Judge Hartford stepped down from the gallows platform, his black robes rustling in the morning breeze. The elderly jurist had presided over dozens of hangings in his career, but something about this case had been eating at him since the verdict. Now, faced with the reality of what his sentence meant, he was having serious doubts about the path of justice. "Marshal Garrett," Hartford said formally, "I hereby suspend the execution order pending a review of new evidence that has come to light." "You can't do that," Garrett snapped. "The sentence was legally imposed, and it can be legally suspended," Hartford replied with growing confidence, "especially when there are credible allegations of perjured testimony and prosecutorial misconduct." Samuel Fletcher, the traveling merchant whose lies had helped convict Cass, was now backing away from the confrontation entirely. He had expected to collect his reward money and disappear, not to be exposed as a perjurer in front of half the territory. His nervous movements caught the attention of several townspeople who began to surround him. "Where are you going, Fletcher?" called out Ben Morrison, the local blacksmith. "Got somewhere important to be all of a sudden?" Fletcher's face went pale as he realized he was trapped between an angry crowd and the ongoing standoff. I need to check on my wagon," he stammered. "Your wagon can wait," said Martha Hendricks, the postmaster's wife. "We want to hear more about this gold shipment you claim to know about." "Funny thing is, my husband handles all the government correspondence for this town, and he hasn't seen anything about any gold shipment." The net was closing around Fletcher, and everyone could see it. His testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Cass, and if it was proven false, the entire proceeding would collapse. Jake Morrison watched these developments with keen interest, but his primary focus remained on the gun pressed against Cass's head. He had to find a way to distract Garrett long enough for one of his men to take action, but the deputy marshal was too experienced to fall for obvious tricks. "Garrett," Jake said conversationally, "you ever wonder how I knew exactly when and where you'd be holding this execution?" The question caught Garrett off guard. He had assumed that Morrison's gang had simply been watching the town, but Jake's tone suggested something more specific. "What are you talking about?" "Well," Jake continued, taking a small step closer, "see, the thing about small towns is that everybody talks, and when you're planning something as big as a public hanging, word tends to spread pretty far and pretty fast." Another step. Garrett noticed the movement, but couldn't back away without potentially exposing himself to fire from the surrounding buildings. "But that's not the interesting part," Jake went on. "The interesting part is who told me about the exact timing, the positioning of guards, even the fact that you'd be using the girl as bait to draw me out." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." "Am I?" Jake's smile was cold. "Tell me, Marshal, who suggested using Miss Williams as bait? In the first place, who convinced you that a public execution would be the best way to flush out my gang? Who provided all those convenient details about our supposed crimes and whereabouts?" The implication hit Garrett like a physical blow. Someone had been feeding information to Morrison's gang, someone with inside knowledge of law enforcement operations. "But who? That's impossible," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Jake took another step, now close enough to see the sweat beading on Garrett's forehead. "You want to know who your informant is, Marshal? Look around. Look at the faces of the people who are supposed to be supporting you. See anyone who looks nervous?" Garrett's eyes swept the crowd, and they stopped on a familiar figure near the hotel entrance. Deputy Marshal William Cross, who had arrived in Millfield 2 days earlier as part of Garrett's backup team, was standing well away from the action, his hand resting on his gun, but his posture suggesting he was ready to run rather than fight. Cross had been asking a lot of questions about the operation, questions that Garrett had attributed to thoroughness, but now seemed more suspicious. He had also been the one to suggest using Cass as bait, arguing that Morrison would never leave his woman to die. "Cross!" Garrett called out, his voice tight with suspicion. Get yourself over here, now." Deputy Marshal Cross hesitated, which was answer enough. Instead of approaching, he began backing toward his horse, which was conveniently positioned near the hotel's rear exit. "Going somewhere, partner?" Garrett's voice was deadly quiet. "This has gone too far, Thomas," Cross replied, no longer bothering to hide his guilt. "The girl doesn't deserve to die for this. The girl is a convicted criminal," Garrett snarled. "The girl is an innocent woman who fell in love with the wrong man," Cross shot back, "and you're about to commit murder to salvage your reputation." The revelation that his own partner had been working with Morrison's gang sent Garrett into a rage that overrode his tactical thinking. He swung his gun away from Cass's head, pointing it instead at Cross, and in that moment of distraction, everything changed. Jake Morrison moved with the speed of a striking snake, covering the remaining distance between himself and Garrett in 2 quick strides. His shoulder caught the deputy marshal in the midsection, driving him backward and away from Cass. The 2 men hit the ground hard, rolling in the dust as each tried to gain control of Garrett's weapon. Sheriff Blackwood immediately moved to protect Cass, pulling her away from the struggling men and working to untie her bonds. "Easy, girl," he said gently. "You're safe now." The fight between Jake and Garrett was brief, but vicious. Both men were experienced in close combat, but Jake had the advantage of desperation and righteous anger. Within seconds, he had Garrett's gun and was pressing it to the deputy marshal's throat. "Don't!" Garrett gasped, his face red from exertion, and the pressure of Jake's forearm across his windpipe. "Give me one good reason," Jake replied, his voice emotionless. "Because you're not a murderer," Cass said quietly. She was free now, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had chafed them raw. "Because killing him won't change anything, won't make you any less of an outlaw." Jake looked up at her, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with, despite all the obstacles the world had thrown in their path. She was right, of course. Thomas Garrett was a corrupt lawman and a would-be murderer, but killing him in cold blood would make Jake no better than the worst of the men he rode with. "You're right," Jake said, releasing his grip on Garrett's throat. "But that doesn't mean he walks away free." Judge Hartford approached the group, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Morrison, I realize you have no reason to trust the legal system after what happened here today, but I'd like to propose a solution that might satisfy everyone." Jake looked skeptical. "I'm listening." "Deputy Marshal Cross has just confessed to providing information to your organization," Hartford said. "Marshal Garrett has attempted to execute a woman based on perjured testimony and manufactured evidence. Both men have violated their oaths and committed serious crimes. So I'm prepared to dismiss all charges against Miss Williams in exchange for your testimony about the corruption in this case. Furthermore, I'll guarantee safe passage for you and your men to leave this territory without pursuit, provided you commit no further crimes in the process." It was an unprecedented offer from a territorial judge, but Hartford seemed sincere. The events of the day had clearly shaken his faith in the system he had served for so many years. Jake considered the proposal. It would mean freedom for Cass and safety for his gang, but it would also mean trusting a system that had already betrayed them once. "What about them?" Jake nodded toward Garrett and Cross. "They'll face federal charges for corruption and attempted murder," Hartford replied. "I'll see to it personally." Deputy Marshal Cross, who had been listening to this exchange with a growing alarm, suddenly broke for his horse. He had apparently decided that his chances were better running than facing federal prosecution. But he had forgotten about the 19 armed men positioned throughout the town. The shot came from Charlie Brennan, positioned behind the grain silo. It was a clean shot through the shoulder that spun Cross around and dropped him in the street without killing him. Charlie had been with the gang for 3 years, and his orders were clear: nobody leaves without Jake's permission. "Guess that settles that," Tommy Red Sullivan called out from his position on the ridge. The former cavalry sergeant had finally come down from the hills and was approaching the group with his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. Thomas Garrett struggled to his feet, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and he was facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. But he wasn't ready to surrender quietly. "This isn't over, Morrison," he snarled. "You think one corrupt judge can protect you? There are 50 more lawmen on their way here right now, and they'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Then we better get moving," Jake replied calmly. He turned to Cass, taking her hands in his. "I'm sorry you had to go through this. I never wanted you to get hurt because of me." "I know," she said softly, "but it's over now. We're both free." Jake shook his head. "You're free, but I'm still wanted in 3 territories, and that's not going to change. You could have a normal life here, Cass. You could marry someone respectable, have children, be part of this community." "I could," she agreed, "but I don't want to. I want to be with you, Jake Morrison, whatever that means." Judge Hartford cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I might make a suggestion, there are territories out west where a man can start fresh if he's willing to leave his past behind. California, Oregon, even some parts of Colorado, where the law is more flexible." "And what about the gang?" Jake asked, looking around at the men who had risked their lives to save him and Cass. "Every man makes his own choice," Red Sullivan said, speaking for the group. "Some of us might be ready to try something different. Others—" He shrugged. "Well, the Outlaw Trail is all some folks know." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A cloud of dust on the horizon suggested that Garrett might not have been bluffing about reinforcements after all. Judge Hartford squinted into the distance, then turned to Jake with urgency. "You need to leave now. I can handle the legal aftermath, but if federal marshals arrive and find you here, our agreement won't mean anything." Jake nodded, understanding the situation. He looked around at the town of Millfield, at the people who had ultimately chosen to stand up for justice, despite the risks to themselves. It was more than he had expected from a frontier community. "Judge," he said formally, "I give you my word that Miss Williams had no knowledge of any criminal activities. She never provided information about law enforcement operations, never helped plan any jobs, never did anything except care about someone who probably didn't deserve it." "I believe you," Hartford replied, "and I'll make sure that's part of the official record." Jake turned to Sheriff Blackwood and extended his hand. "Thank you for doing the right thing when it mattered." Blackwood shook the offered hand without hesitation. "Just promise me you'll take care of that girl. She's been through enough, I promise." The sound of horses was getting closer now, and Jake could see that his men were already mounting up and preparing to leave. The time for conversation was over. He helped Cass onto his horse, then swung up behind her. For a moment, they sat, looking, down at the town that had almost witnessed her execution, the place where they had found each other and nearly lost everything. "Ready?" Jake asked quietly. "Ready," Cass replied, leaning back against his chest, and with that, Jake Morrison kicked his horse into a gallop, riding hard toward the western hills with the woman he loved and the promise of a new life somewhere, beyond the reach of corrupt lawmen and frontier justice. The horse's hooves thundered across the hard-packed earth as Jake Morrison's gang rode west through the Texas hill country. Behind them, the dust cloud from the approaching federal marshals grew larger, but Jake wasn't concerned about immediate pursuit. His men knew these trails better than any lawman, and they had at least a 2-hour head start before the Federals could organize a proper chase. Cass held tight to Jake's waist as they navigated the rocky terrain, her auburn hair streaming behind. Her in the wind. She had never ridden this hard before, never felt the exhilaration of freedom mixed with the very real danger of capture. But despite the circumstances, she felt more alive than she had in months. "Where are we heading?" she called, out over the sound of the wind and hoofbeats. "Safe house about 15 miles north," Jake replied. "We'll rest the horses there and figure out our next move." The safe house turned out to be an abandoned ranch that had been foreclosed on by corrupt bankers 3 years earlier. The Morrison gang had been using it as a way station ever since, and it was well stocked with supplies, fresh horses and weapons. More importantly, it sat in a natural bowl surrounded by hills that made it nearly impossible to approach without being seen. As the gang rode into the hidden valley, Cass got her first real look at the men who had risked everything to save her life. They were a rough bunch by any standard, weathered faces, hard eyes, and the kind of casual competence with weapons that came from years of living outside the law. But there was something else there too, a loyalty and camaraderie that she hadn't expected. Tommy Red Sullivan was the first to dismount, immediately beginning to tend to his horse with the practiced efficiency of an old cavalry soldier. Charlie Brennan, the man who had shot Deputy Marshal Cross, was barely 20 but carried himself like a veteran. Diego Morales, a former vaquero from south of the border, spoke quietly in Spanish to his mount as he removed the saddle. "These are good men," Jake said, noticing her observations. "Most of them didn't choose this life. It chose them." As the gang settled in for the evening, Jake gathered his lieutenants around a crude wooden table to discuss their options. Red Sullivan spread out a hand-drawn map of the Western Territories, marking known safe routes and areas with heavy law enforcement presence. "California's still our best bet," Red said, tracing a path with his finger, "but we're going to have to go through some dangerous country to get there. Apache territory, desert, and at least 3 towns where the local sheriffs have standing. Orders to shoot outlaws on sight." "What about Colorado?" asked Frank Patterson, a former bank clerk who had turned to outlawry after his employer framed him for embezzlement. "I heard they're more interested in mining disputes than chasing outlaws these days." "Colorado's got potential," Jake agreed, "but the winters are hard, and there's not much opportunity for honest work if a man wants to go straight." The conversation continued for over an hour, with each man sharing what he knew about various territories and their prospects for both continued outlawry and legitimate employment. It was a discussion that revealed the complex motivations of Jake's gang. Some were committed to the outlaw life, while others were looking for a chance to start over. Cass listened from across the room, gradually understanding that this wasn't just about her and Jake anymore. The events in Millfield had forced the entire gang to confront their futures. Some of these men had families they hadn't seen in years, parents who thought they were dead, wives who had remarried believing themselves. Widows. "What about splitting up?" suggested Miguel Santos, a soft-spoken man who had joined the gang after killing a crooked land agent in self-defense. "Smaller groups are harder to track, and it gives everyone more options." Jake considered this. "Maybe. But we're stronger together, and there's safety in numbers." "Not always," Red Sullivan interjected. 20 men riding together draws attention. 4 or 5 men can blend in, find work, maybe even settle down somewhere, without anyone asking too many questions." The debate revealed a fundamental split within the gang. The younger men, those who had joined more recently, were inclined toward continued outlawry. They saw themselves as rebels against a corrupt system, and the idea of going legitimate held little appeal. But the older members, the ones who had been riding with Jake for years, were tired of constantly looking over their shoulders. "I'm 53 years old," admitted Henry Caldwell, the gang's unofficial cook and medic. "Been running from the law for 8 years now, and I'm tired. Tired of sleeping on the ground, tired of eating beans and hardtack, tired of never knowing if tomorrow's the day I catch a bullet." His words carried weight because Henry was respected by everyone in the gang. He had saved lives, patched up wounds, and provided a steadying influence during difficult times. If Henry Caldwell was ready to quit the outlaw trail, others were probably thinking the same thing. Jake looked around the table at faces he had come to know as well as his own family. These men had followed him through robberies, shootouts, and narrow escapes. They had trusted his judgment and risked their lives based on his decisions. Now he was asking them to trust him one more time, in perhaps the biggest gamble of all, the chance at a legitimate life. "Here's what I'm thinking," Jake said finally. "We ride together as far as the Colorado border. From there, any man who wants to split off can do so with his share of our treasury and my blessing. Those who want to continue on to California or Oregon can stay with the group." It was a reasonable compromise that acknowledged both the practical realities of their situation and the individual desires of gang members. But it also meant that the Morrison gang, as it had existed for the past 4 years, was coming to an end. Red Sullivan nodded slowly. "I can live with that. But we need to be smart about how we travel. Federal marshals will be watching all the main routes, and there's probably paper out on every one of us by now." "We go through Indian Territory," Jake decided. "It's dangerous, but the army's too busy with the Apache Wars to worry about outlaws, and most settlers won't venture into that country." The mention of Indian Territory sobered everyone. The Comanche and Kiowa were still actively raiding in parts of Texas and Oklahoma, and the Army's presence was spotty at best. But it was also the one place where federal marshals were unlikely to follow, at least not in large numbers. As the strategic discussion continued, Cass found herself in conversation with Elena Rodriguez, the wife of gang member Carlos Rodriguez. Elena was one of only 3 women traveling with the gang, and she had been living the outlaw life for over 2 years. "It's not easy," Elena said frankly, responding to Cass's unspoken questions. "The men try to protect us, but there are times when that's not possible. You have to be ready to defend yourself, to make hard choices, to live with uncertainty every day." "Do you regret it?" Cass asked. Elena considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, but I love Carlos, and this is the life he chose. I could have stayed in San Antonio, married a shopkeeper, had a safe and predictable life, but it wouldn't have been the life I wanted. What about children? Do you want a family? Someday, when we can settle somewhere, but not while we're running from the law. It wouldn't be fair to bring children into this kind of life." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Charlie Brennan had been standing watch on the ridge above the ranch, and he was now riding hard toward the main building with news. "Riders coming," Charlie announced as he slid from his horse. "Maybe a dozen men, still about 5 miles out, but heading this way." Jake immediately shifted into command mode. "How many?" he asked, though Charlie had already answered. 12, maybe 13, moving fast but not racing. Could be marshals, could be bounty hunters. Could be anyone, Red Sullivan added grimly. Word of what happened in Millfield is probably spreading fast. Every lawman and bounty hunter in 3 territories will be looking for us. Jake made a quick decision. We leave in 15 minutes. Everyone take only what they can carry on horseback. Elena, help Cass gather what she needs. The next quarter hour was a whirlwind of activity as the gang prepared to abandon their safe house. Weapons were checked, supplies were distributed, and horses were saddled with the efficiency that comes from years of practice. But there was also an underlying tension, the knowledge that this might be the beginning of the end for the Morrison gang. As they prepared to ride out, Jake pulled Cass aside for a private conversation. The weight of leadership was evident in his eyes, the burden of knowing that his decisions would determine the fate of 20 men and 3 women. "It's not too late to change your mind," he said quietly. "We could get you to a town where you'd be safe, where you could send word to Judge Hartford. He'd protect you, help you start over." Cass shook her head firmly. "We've been through this, Jake. I'm not going anywhere without you. This isn't going to be easy. We're talking about months of hard riding, sleeping rough, never knowing who to trust. and there's no guarantee we'll make it to wherever we're going." "I know," she replied, "but I'd rather face those dangers with you than live safely without." Jake studied her face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. What he saw instead was determination and a strength he was only beginning to appreciate. Cassandra Williams had been raised as a proper frontier lady, taught to be obedient and decorative. But the events of the past few days had revealed something harder underneath, a core of steel that would serve her well in the life she was choosing. "All right then," he said, helping her mount her horse. "But if things get too dangerous, if there comes a time when staying with me puts you at risk, I want your word that you'll do what's necessary to survive." "Only if you promise the same thing," she countered. Before Jake could respond, Red Sullivan called out from the ridge. "They're closing fast, Jake. We need to move now." The gang rode out of the hidden valley in two groups, taking different routes to confuse any potential trackers. Jake and Cass rode with the main group, following ancient game trails through terrain that would challenge even experienced horsemen. Behind them, the dust cloud of their pursuers grew smaller, but never disappeared entirely. As night fell, they were still moving, navigating by starlight through a country that seemed to belong more to the previous century than to the modern world of telegraphs and railroad lines. This was the frontier in its rawest form, where survival depended on skill, luck, and the loyalty of the people riding beside you. "How much farther?" Cass asked, exhaustion evident in her voice. "We'll ride until dawn," Jake replied. "Then find a place to rest during the heat of the day. It's going to be like this for weeks, maybe months." As if to emphasize his point, a coyote howled somewhere in the darkness ahead of them, answered by another from a different direction. The sound was both beautiful and eerie, a reminder that they were now truly in the wilderness, far from the laws and customs of civilization. "No turning back now?" Red Sullivan commented from nearby. "No," Jake agreed, looking back once toward the direction they had come from. "No turning back." The Morrison gang rode on through the night, 23, souls bound together by loyalty, desperation, and the shared dream of finding a place where the past couldn't follow. Behind them lay everything they had ever known. Ahead lay only uncertainty and the hope that somewhere in the vast American West there was still room for people who had chosen love over law, freedom over safety. The real journey was just beginning. 3 weeks into their journey through the Badlands of Oklahoma Territory, the Morrison gang faced their first real test. They had successfully evaded the federal marshals and bounty hunters who had pursued them from Texas, but now they encountered a different kind of danger entirely. The Comanche war party consisted of 8 warriors, and they had been tracking the gang for 2 days before finally revealing themselves. Jake first spotted them, silhouetted against the dawn sky on a ridge overlooking their camp, sitting motionless on their ponies like bronze statues come to life. Nobody moved suddenly. Jake whispered to his companions as they slowly awakened to find themselves surrounded. The Comanche had positioned themselves strategically around the small valley where the gang had made camp, cutting off all obvious escape routes. Red Sullivan, ever the former cavalry sergeant, immediately assessed their tactical situation. "They could have killed us in our sleep if they wanted to," he observed quietly. "This isn't a war party, it's a negotiation." The leader of the Comanche warriors was a man of perhaps 40, with graying hair braided with feathers and a face marked by old battle scars. He rode down into the camp alone, his rifle resting across his saddle, but not pointed at anyone specifically. When he spoke, it was in heavily accented but clear English. "You cross our land without permission," he said simply. "This requires payment." Jake stood slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. He had dealt with Indian tribes before, both as enemies and as trading partners, and he understood that this was indeed a negotiation rather than a prelude to violence. "We're just passing through," Jake replied respectfully. "We have no quarrel with your people." The Comanche leader studied Jake for a long moment, then let his gaze move across the rest of the group. His eyes lingered on Cass and the other women, but not in a threatening way, more like he was trying to understand what kind of group this was. "You are not soldiers," the warrior observed. "Not settlers. You carry a lot of ammunition, good. Horses. You are running from something." "We are," Jake admitted. There was no point in lying to someone this perceptive. "From the blue coats?" "From the law, yes." The Comanche leader nodded, as if this explained everything. "The white man's law is not our law, but you still cross our land. Payment is required." Red Sullivan stepped forward slightly. "What kind of payment are you looking for?" "Rifles," the warrior said immediately. "And ammunition. The army takes our buffalo, drives us from our hunting grounds. We need weapons to feed our people." It was a reasonable request under the circumstances, but it would significantly reduce the gang's firepower and ammunition reserves. Jake looked around at his men, reading their faces. Most seemed willing to pay the toll rather than fight, but a few of the younger outlaws looked ready for violence. "How many rifles?" Jake asked. "5, with ammunition." Jake considered this. 5 rifles was a significant portion of their arsenal, but fighting 8 Comanche warriors in their own territory would likely cost more lives than weapons. And there was something about this leader that suggested he could be trusted to honor an agreement. 5 rifles, 50 rounds of ammunition each, Jake counted. "In exchange for safe passage through your territory and information about army movements in the area." The Comanche leader smiled slightly, apparently appreciating Jake's negotiating skills. "You learn our ways quickly, white man. I am called Iron Hawk. This is acceptable." The exchange took place with a formal ceremony. Jake selected 5 of their older rifles, keeping the newest and most reliable weapons for his gang. Iron Hawk examined each weapon carefully, checking the action and sighting down the barrel with the expertise of someone who understood firearms intimately. "These are good weapons," Ironhawk pronounced. "They will serve our hunters well." As the ammunition was being counted out, Ironhawk provided the promised information about army movements. A cavalry patrol had passed through the area 3 days earlier, heading east toward the Texas border. There were no permanent army posts within 50 miles, but there were rumors of a new fort being established further north near the Kansas border. More importantly, Iron Hawk warned them about a group of white men who had been asking questions in trading posts throughout the territory. The description matched that of bounty hunters, and they seemed to be following the same general route as the Morrison gang. "How many men?" Red Sullivan asked. 12, maybe 15. They carry papers with pictures. They seek someone specific. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Wanted posters with his likeness had been circulating for years, but the federal government had recently increased the bounty on his head to $5,000, enough to attract serious competition from professional manhunters. "How far?" "Behind us," Jake asked. 2 days, maybe 3. They move slower, ask many questions, but they follow your trail." This was troubling news. The gang had been careful to cover their tracks, but 15 men with tracking experience and substantial financial motivation would be difficult to shake permanently. After the Comanche warriors departed, Jake called his lieutenants together for a strategy meeting. The mood was more serious than it had been since leaving Texas, and several gang members were questioning whether they should have fought the Indians rather than giving up weapons they might need later. "We did the right thing," Jake insisted. "Fighting would have cost us men we can't afford to lose, and Iron Hawk's information is worth more than those rifles." "Maybe," said Carlos Rodriguez, "but now we're down 5 weapons and being chased by bounty hunters who are gaining ground. That doesn't sound like a winning combination to me." Elena Rodriguez, Carlos's wife, had been quiet during most of the journey, but now she spoke up with an observation that surprised everyone. The Comanche knew exactly how many of us there were, she said. They knew we had women with us, knew our approximate route, even knew we were running from the law. That suggests they've been watching us for longer than 2 days. Her comment sent a ripple of unease through the group. If the Comanche had been observing them for an extended period, what else might they have seen? More importantly, who else might be watching? Charlie Brennan voiced what everyone was thinking. You think they're working with the bounty hunters? Not necessarily, Jake replied thoughtfully, but Ironhawk might have decided that information about our movements has value to more than one buyer. It was a sobering possibility. The Comanche had their own survival to consider, and playing multiple sides against each other was a time-honored strategy for outnumbered peoples. They might have been genuinely friendly to the Morrison gang while simultaneously providing information to their pursuers. So what do we do? Asked Frank Patterson. Jake studied their hand-drawn map, considering their options. They were still 3 weeks away from the Colorado border, traveling through increasingly hostile territory with reduced firepower and determined pursuit. The smart move might be to abandon their planned route entirely. We change direction, Jake decided. Instead of heading northwest toward Colorado, we go due west into New Mexico territory. The terrain is harder, but there are more places to hide, and the armies spread thinner. That's Apache country, Red Sullivan warned. Makes the Comanche look friendly by comparison. Apache don't usually bother small groups that aren't threatening their settlements, Jake replied, and the bounty hunters will be expecting us to continue toward Colorado. This might throw them off our trail entirely. It was a risky gamble, but the alternatives seemed worse. They could try to outrun the bounty hunters, but their horses were already showing signs of fatigue from 3 weeks of hard travel. They could try to set up an ambush, but 15 professional manhunters would be difficult to surprise and dangerous to fight. As they prepared to change course, Cass approached Jake with a proposal that caught him completely off guard. I want to learn to shoot, she said simply. Jake looked at her in surprise. What brought this on? Elena's been teaching me about life on the trail, about what it really means to be with an outlaw gang. She says every person needs to be able to defend themselves, because there will be times when the men can't protect everyone. It was a practical request, but Jake was reluctant. Teaching Cass to use weapons would be acknowledging that their situation was dangerous enough to require it, and part of him still hoped they could reach safety without her ever needing such skills. It's not as easy as it looks in dime novels, Jake warned. I don't expect it to be easy, but Elena says you're one of the best teachers she's seen, and I trust you to show me what I need to know. Red Sullivan overheard the conversation and added his support. She's right, Jake. We can't guarantee anyone's safety out here, and an extra gun could make the difference in a tight spot. So that afternoon, while the gang rested during the heat of the day, Jake began teaching Cass the basics of firearms. They started with a small Colt .32 revolver, lighter and easier to handle than the larger weapons carried by the men. First rule, Jake said, never point a gun at anything you don't intend to destroy. Second rule, always assume every gun is loaded, even when you know it isn't. Third rule, never rely on a gun to solve your problems. It's a tool of last resort. Cass proved to be a quick learner, though her first attempts at target practice were discouraging. Her shots scattered wildly around their makeshift targets, and the recoil of even the small revolver jarred her wrist painfully. I'm hopeless, she said after missing a large rock from 20 feet away. No, you're learning, Jake corrected. Elena couldn't hit the broadside of a barn when Carlos first started teaching her. Now she's one of the better shots in the gang. Elena Rodriguez confirmed this with a laugh. It took me 6 months to hit anything smaller than a buffalo. But Jake's right, anyone can learn if they practice enough. Over the following days, as they traveled deeper into New Mexico territory, Cass's shooting gradually improved. She developed a steady stance and learned to control her breathing, and her shots began clustering closer to their intended targets. More importantly, she gained confidence in handling weapons, which was often more valuable than perfect marksmanship. The landscape around them was changing as they moved west. The rolling hills and scattered trees of Oklahoma gave way to more rugged country, deep canyons, mesas, and desert terrain that could hide an army or kill the unwary with equal efficiency. It was beautiful but harsh, a land that demanded respect and punished mistakes. On their fourth day in New Mexico territory, they encountered their first Apache. Unlike the formal negotiation with the Comanche, this meeting was entirely accidental. The gang rounded a bend in a narrow canyon and found themselves face to face with 3 Apache warriors watering their horses at a small spring. For a moment, nobody moved. The Apache were as surprised as the outlaws, but they recovered more quickly, immediately reaching for their weapons. Jake raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace, while simultaneously positioning himself between the warriors and Cass. The leader of the Apache was a young man, probably no more than 25, with the lean build and watchful eyes of someone who had spent his entire life in hostile territory. He spoke rapidly to his companions in their own language, then addressed Jake in broken English. "You bring many people through our land," he said. "Why?" "We're traveling west," Jake replied carefully. "We don't want trouble with your people, all." "Whites bring trouble," the Apache replied. "But you do not wear soldier clothes. You do not carry survey equipment. What are you?" It was the same question the Comanche had asked, and Jake gave essentially the same answer. "We're running from the white man's law." The Apache considered this, apparently finding it acceptable. "The white man's law is foolish. It protects those who steal land and kills those who defend their families. We're not soldiers or settlers," Jake assured him. "We just want to pass through peacefully." After a brief consultation with his companions, the Apache warrior nodded. "You may continue, but do not camp near our villages, and do not hunt in our territory. The desert will provide water if you know where to look." With that cryptic advice, the 3 Apache warriors mounted their horses and disappeared into the canyon walls as silently as they had appeared. The entire encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it left the gang members shaken by how quickly violence could have erupted. "Friendly bunch," Charlie Brennan muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They could have killed us all before we knew they were there," Red Sullivan observed. "The fact that they didn't suggest they're more interested in avoiding trouble than causing it." As they continued west, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Water sources were scarce, and the heat during the day was brutal. But they were also moving through a country where pursuit would be extremely difficult, and there had been no sign of the bounty hunters since changing direction. On the 10th day, in New Mexico territory, they reached a decision point that would determine their ultimate destination. To the north lay Colorado and the possibility of disappearing into a mining country where questions weren't asked. To the west lay California and the promise of new opportunities in a rapidly growing territory. To the south lay Mexico, where American law held no jurisdiction but where other dangers awaited. Jake called for a vote, honoring his promise to let each gang member choose his own fate. The results reflected the divisions that had been building within the group for weeks. 7 men, including Red Sullivan and Henry Caldwell, chose to head north toward Colorado. 6 men, led by Carlos Rodriguez, decided to continue west to California. The remaining gang members, mostly the youngest and most committed to the outlaw life, voted to head south to Mexico. It was the end of the Morrison gang as a unified force, but it was also the beginning of new possibilities for everyone involved. As they prepared to part ways at a crossroads, marked only by a weathered wooden sign and a dry well, Jake realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day they rode out of Millfield. "It's been an honor riding with all of you," Jake said to the assembled group. "Whatever happens from here, remember that we looked out for each other when it mattered." The farewells were brief but emotional. These men had shared dangers and hardships that created bonds stronger than family, and they all knew this might be the last time they would ever see each other. As the three groups prepared to go their separate ways, Cass made her own choice clear by staying close to Jake's horse. She had cast her lot with the California group, trusting that somewhere in that distant territory lay the possibility of the new life they had been seeking. "Ready for the last leg of the journey?" Jake asked her. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, checking the Colt 32 now strapped to her hip. The Morrison gang was dead, but Jake Morrison and Cassandra Williams were very much alive, and their story was far from over. The California-bound group consisted of 7 souls: Jake Morrison, Cassandra Williams, Carlos and Elena Rodriguez, Miguel Santos, Frank Patterson, and a quiet newcomer named Thomas Whitmore, who had joined them only 2 weeks before the split. They rode west through the Sonoran Desert, following ancient trading routes that had been used by Spanish explorers centuries before the first American settlers arrived. The landscape was unlike anything Cass had ever experienced. Towering saguaro, cacti stood like sentinels against the blazing sky, their arms reaching toward heaven in silent supplication. The desert floor was carpeted with smaller cacti, creosote bushes, and hardy wildflowers that bloomed in defiant splashes of color despite the harsh conditions. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was also deadly to those who underestimated its challenges. Water was their constant concern. The desert springs marked on their crude maps were often dry or poisoned with alkali, forcing them to ration their supplies carefully and travel primarily at night to avoid the brutal daytime heat. During the day, they sought shelter wherever they could find it, under rocky overhangs, in the shade of massive boulders, or in abandoned adobe ruins, left by long-vanished inhabitants. "How much farther to the Colorado River?" Cass asked on their 5th day in the desert. The heat was already oppressive despite the early hour, and their water supplies were running dangerously low. 3 days, maybe 4 if we have to detour. "Around trouble," Jake replied, studying the distant mountains that marked the California border. "There's supposed to be a trading post at the crossing, run by a man named Dutch Henderson. If it's still there, we can resupply before the final push to Los Angeles." Thomas Whitmore, who had been unusually quiet since joining their group, suddenly spoke up. "What makes you think Henderson's place is still operating? Last I heard, the Apache burned out most of the traders in this area." It was a good question, and one that Jake had been avoiding thinking about. Their entire plan depended on finding supplies at the Colorado River crossing, but they had no recent information about conditions there. If the trading post was gone, they would have to attempt the final stretch to California with whatever water they could carry, a potentially fatal gamble. "We'll deal with that when we get there," Jake said, but his tone suggested he was more worried than he wanted to admit. As they traveled deeper into the desert, the group began to experience the strange camaraderie that comes from shared hardship. Miguel Santos, normally reserved and solitary, began sharing stories of his childhood in Sonora. Frank Patterson, the former bank clerk, proved surprisingly adept at finding edible desert plants and hidden water sources. Even Thomas Whitmore started to open up, revealing that he had once worked as a surveyor for the railroad and knew more about desert navigation than he had initially let on. Elena Rodriguez continued her informal education of Cass in the practical skills needed for frontier life. She taught her how to mend clothes with cactus needles and plant fibers, how to recognize the signs of approaching sandstorms, and how to conserve water during extreme heat. More importantly, she helped Cass understand the unspoken dynamics of their small group. Carlos doesn't trust Whitmore, Elena confided during one of their rest stops. He thinks the man's hiding something important. What kind of something? Cass asked. That's the question. Whitmore knows too much about things he shouldn't know about. Military movements, law enforcement patterns, even details about some of our previous jobs. Either he's incredibly well informed for a drifter, or he's not what he claims to be. The suspicion about Whitmore came to a head on their 7th day in the desert. They had stopped to rest in the ruins of an old Spanish mission, seeking shelter from a fierce sandstorm that had blown up from the south. As they huddled in what remained of the chapel, Frank Patterson made a disturbing discovery. "Jake," Frank called quietly, "you need to see this." He was examining Whitmore's saddlebags, which had been damaged when his horse stumbled into a hidden wash earlier that day. The contents had spilled out, and among the usual trail supplies was something that didn't belong. A leather portfolio containing official documents. Jake examined the papers by the light of their carefully shielded campfire. What he found made his blood run cold. Thomas Whitmore was actually Deputy Marshal Theodore Whitman, a federal agent who had been tracking the Morrison gang for over 6 months. The portfolio contained detailed reports on the gang's activities, copies of wanted posters, and most damning of all, a letter of authorization to recruit local informants and use any means necessary to bring Jake Morrison to justice. "Son of a bitch," Carlos Rodriguez muttered when Jake showed him the evidence. "I knew something was wrong with that man." The question was what to do about it. Whitmore was currently unconscious, having hit his head when his horse fell. They could simply leave him in the desert to die, take him prisoner, or try to use his situation to their advantage somehow. Each option carried significant risks. "We can't just kill him," Cass said when Jake outlined their choices. "That would make us no better than the corrupt lawman we've been running from." "He's a federal marshal," Miguel Santos pointed out. "If we let him live, he'll bring the entire army down on us. Men like that don't just give up." Elena Rodriguez offered a different perspective. "Maybe he doesn't have a choice either. Federal marshals follow orders just like everyone else. The question is whether he's a decent man doing an unpleasant job or a killer wearing a badge." They decided to wait until Whitmore regained consciousness and then confront him with the evidence. When he finally awakened, his first reaction was not surprise or denial, but what appeared to be genuine relief. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said, sitting up carefully and touching the bandage Elena had applied to his head wound. "I'm surprised it took this long." "So you admit it?" Jake asked, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt 45. "I admit I'm Deputy Marshal Theodore Whitman, yes. I admit I've been tracking your gang for months. But I don't admit to being your enemy. It was an unexpected response that caught everyone off guard. Jake had been prepared for lies, threats, or pleas for mercy, but not for this calm acknowledgement." "Explain," Jake said simply. Whitman looked around at the group, his eyes settling on each face before returning to Jake. "I've been a federal marshal for 8 years. In that time, I've seen more corruption, brutality, and injustice wearing badges than I ever saw among the outlaws I was supposed to catch. Men like Thomas Garrett aren't the exception. They're becoming the rule. So why keep doing the job?" Carlos asked suspiciously. "Because I thought I could make a difference from the inside. I thought if good men stayed in law enforcement, we could clean up the system. But what happened in Millfield changed my mind." Whitman explained that he had been in the area when the events in Millfield unfolded, though he had arrived too late to intervene. He had interviewed witnesses, reviewed the evidence, and spoken with Judge Hartford about the corruption in Garrett's investigation. "That woman," he said, looking at Cass, "was nearly murdered by the system I swore to uphold. And for what? So a corrupt marshal could advance his career and collect bounty money. That's when I realized the system can't be reformed. It has to be abandoned. So you decided to join us?" Jake's tone was skeptical. "I decided to disappear. Theodore Whitman is going to die in the desert, and Thomas Whitmore is going to start a new life in California. But first, I wanted to make sure you knew what you're really up against." Whitman revealed information that sent chills through the entire group. The federal government had placed a bounty of $10,000 on Jake Morrison, enough money to attract every professional manhunter in the country. More than that, they had issued special warrants that allowed bounty hunters to operate with the same authority as federal marshals, including the right to deputize local men and commandeer supplies. "There are at least 3 major bounty hunting operations tracking you," Whitman continued. "The group that was following you through Oklahoma Territory is just one of them. Another is coming up from Mexico, and a third is already in California, waiting for you to arrive." The news was devastating. They had thought that splitting up the gang and changing their route would buy them safety, but instead they were walking into a carefully laid trap. "How do you know all this?" Frank Patterson asked. "Because I was supposed to coordinate with them," Whitman admitted. "My orders were to infiltrate your group, determine your destination, and then signal the bounty hunters when you were within striking distance." "But you didn't," Eleanor observed. "No, I didn't. And now I'm as wanted as you are because Theodore Whitman was supposed to report in 3 days ago." The revelation forced the group to completely reconsider their plans. California was no longer a destination. It was a death trap. But they were already committed to crossing the desert, and turning back would mean certain capture by the bounty hunters following from behind. "What do you suggest?" Jake asked Whitman. "We continue to the Colorado River crossing, but we don't head for Los Angeles. Instead, we go north into the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's rough country, but there are mining camps where a man can disappear if he's willing to work hard and keep his head down." "And then what?" Cass asked. "Then we see if it's possible to build new lives as new people," Whitman replied. "Theodore Whitman dies in the desert, Jake Morrison dies in the mountains, and whoever we become after that, we become together." It was a radical proposal that would require them to abandon not just their identities, but their entire past lives. For Cass, it meant giving up any hope of ever returning to the respectable world she had been raised for. For Jake, it meant abandoning the outlaw reputation that had defined him for years. For all of them, it meant trusting a man who had been lying to them for weeks. "How do we know you're telling the truth now?" Miguel Santos asked the question they were all thinking. "You don't," Whitman admitted. "But consider this. If I was still working for the federal government, would I have told you about the bounty hunters waiting in California? Would I have blown my own cover when I could have simply led you into their trap?" It was a compelling argument, but Jake remained skeptical. "Maybe. Or maybe this is all part of some elaborate plan to get us to trust you." "Then test me," Whitman challenged. "When we reach the Colorado River crossing, let me go in alone to scout the situation. If I betray you, you'll know immediately. If I don't, maybe you'll believe I'm sincere about changing sides." The debate continued through the night as the sandstorm raged outside their shelter. By morning, they had reached a tentative agreement. They would continue to the river crossing, but they would be ready for treachery. If Whitman proved trustworthy, they would consider his proposal about heading into the mountains. If he didn't, they would deal with him accordingly. As they broke camp and resumed their westward journey, Cass found herself riding beside Jake, watching the dawn paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of the landscape was a stark contrast to the deadly games being played by the humans crossing it. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" she asked. "I don't know," Jake replied honestly. "But I'm starting to think it doesn't matter. Whether Whitman is honest or lying, whether we make it to California or die in these mountains, the important thing is that we're facing it together. Is that enough?" Jake considered the question as their horses picked their way across the rocky terrain. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly toward the sunrise. Ahead, the Colorado River and whatever fate awaited them at the crossing. It "Has to be," he said finally, "because it's all we've got." The Colorado River appeared on the horizon 3 days later, a thin ribbon of blue cutting through the red rock landscape. But as they drew closer, it became clear that their troubles were far from over. Smoke was rising from the direction of the trading post, and even from a distance they could see that something was very wrong. The final test of Theodore Whitman's loyalty was about to begin, and with it, the ultimate question of whether love could truly triumph over the forces arrayed against them in the unforgiving American West. The smoke rising from Dutch Henderson's trading post wasn't the lazy curl of a chimney fire. It was the thick, black smoke of destruction, and as their small group crested the final ridge overlooking the Colorado River crossing, they could see the charred remains of what had once been their salvation. "Damn," Theodore Whitman muttered, lowering the field glasses he had been using to survey the scene. "The whole place is burned out." Jake Morrison took the glasses and studied the ruins himself. The trading post had been more than just a store. It had been a small settlement with a blacksmith shop, a stable, and several adobe buildings where travelers could rest before attempting the river crossing. Now it was nothing but blackened timber and crumbling walls. "How recent?" Carlos Rodriguez asked, testing the wind direction to gauge the smell of the smoke. "Yesterday, maybe the day before," Jake replied. "The fire's mostly out, but there are still hot spots. More troubling than the destruction itself was the question of who had caused it. Apache raids were common in this area, but they typically didn't waste time burning buildings completely to the ground. Bandits might loot a trading post, but total destruction suggested something more personal or more strategic. Could be the bounty hunters, Elena Rodriguez suggested. If they knew we were heading here, they might have burned it out to force us into the open. Or it could be coincidence, Miguel Santos added, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Henderson and enemies. Man who runs an isolated trading post usually does." Theodore Whitman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There's something else you should know. Dutch Henderson wasn't just a trader. He was also an informant for the territorial government, reporting on outlaw movements through this area. If the wrong people found out about that..." The revelation hung in the air like the desert heat. Henderson's death, assuming he was dead, might have been revenge for his cooperation with authorities. But it also meant that their movements had likely been reported before the trading post was destroyed. "So they know we're coming?" Frank Patterson said grimly. "They've known for days," Whitman confirmed. "Henderson would have sent word as soon as he spotted riders approaching from the east." Jake studied the terrain around the river crossing with new urgency. The Colorado River ran swift and deep here, cutting through red rock canyons that provided excellent positions for an ambush. There were only 2 practical crossing points within, 50 miles, and both were easily watched from the surrounding cliffs. "We need to get down there and see what's left," Jake decided. "Maybe Henderson had supplies cached somewhere, or maybe there are boats hidden along the riverbank." "And if it's a trap," Carlos asked, "then we spring it on our terms instead of theirs." They approached the ruined trading post in a tactical formation that would have impressed a cavalry officer. Miguel Santos and Frank Patterson circled wide to the north, while Carlos and Elena took the southern approach. Jake, Cass, and Theodore Whitman came straight down the main trail, making themselves obvious targets while the others moved into flanking positions. The ruins were worse up close than they had appeared from the ridge. The main building had been burned so thoroughly that even the stone foundation was cracked from the heat. The stable was gone entirely, reduced to a pile of ash and twisted metal. Most disturbing of all, they found evidence of violence that had preceded the fire. Bullet holes in the remaining walls and dark stains on the ground that could only be dried blood. "Dutch Henderson fought back," Jake observed, examining the defensive positions around what had been the main entrance. "Looks like he took some of them with him." Theodore Whitman was searching through the ruins of Henderson's office, looking for anything that might have survived the fire. He found fragments of correspondence, mostly too damaged to read, but one partially burned letter caught his attention. "Jake," he called quietly, "you need to see this." The letter was addressed to T. Garrett, Deputy Marshal, and was signed with Henderson's distinctive scrawl. Most of the content was illegible, but one line remained clear. "Morrison gang proceeding west as expected. Estimate arrival at crossing within 1 week." "Son of a bitch," Jake breathed. Garrett still alive. The implications were staggering. They had assumed that Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett was finished after the events in Millfield, facing federal charges for corruption and attempted murder. Instead, he was apparently still operating, still pursuing them with the same obsessive determination that had nearly cost Cass her life. "How is that possible?" Cass asked, reading the letter fragment over Jake's shoulder. "Judge Hartford promised he would face prosecution." "Judges can be overruled," Whitman explained grimly. Garrett probably convinced his superiors that he was the victim of an outlaw conspiracy. With $10,000 in bounty money at stake, they'd be willing to overlook a lot of questionable behavior. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion. Miguel Santos was riding hard toward the trading post, his face grim with news that would complicate their situation even. "Further, riders coming from the east," Miguel reported as he slid from his saddle. "Maybe 20 men moving fast. They'll be here within the hour." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before a fight. 20 men meant they were heavily outnumbered, and the burned-out trading post offered little cover for a defensive stand. But running would mean abandoning their only chance to cross the river for hundreds of miles. "Could be Apache," Frank Patterson suggested hopefully. "Apache don't ride in formations of 20, Carlos replied, rejoining the group from his scouting position. "These are white men, and they're following the same trail we used." Theodore Whitman was studying the approaching dust cloud through his field glasses, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "I can make out individual riders now. The man in the lead, I think it's Garrett." Jake took the glasses and confirmed Whitman's identification. Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett was indeed leading the pursuit, recognizable even at a distance by his distinctive military posture and the way he sat his horse. Riding beside him was Samuel Fletcher, the traveling merchant whose perjured testimony had nearly cost Cass her life. "Fletcher," Jake said with disgust, "I should have killed that lying bastard when I had the chance." "He's probably guiding them," Cass observed. "He knows this country from his trading routes." The situation was desperate, but Jake had been in desperate situations before. He quickly assessed their options. They could try to cross the river immediately, hoping to reach the other side before Garrett's men arrived. They could attempt to hold the trading post ruins and fight it out, or they could retreat back into the desert and try to find another crossing point. Each choice carried significant risks. The river was running high from spring snowmelt in the mountains, making it dangerous to cross even under ideal conditions. Fighting 20 men from the ruins would be nearly suicidal. Retreating would mean traveling for days without water through a country that offered no shelter. "There's a fourth option," Theodore Whitman said quietly. "I could surrender myself to Garrett, tell him I captured you and was bringing you in for the bounty. It might buy you enough time to escape." The offer was generous but impractical. "He'd see through that in a minute," Jake replied. "Besides, we're not sacrificing anyone to save the rest." Elena Rodriguez had been studying the river while the men debated strategy. Now she spoke up with an observation that changed everything. "Look at the water level," she said, pointing to marks on the canyon walls. "It's dropped at least 3 feet since yesterday. There must be a beaver dam upstream that's been breached, or maybe a flash flood that's already passed through." Jake looked where she was pointing and saw that she was right. The high water marks on the red rock walls showed that the river had been much higher recently. If the water level was dropping, it might be possible to cross at points that had been Impassable just days earlier. There's an old ford about 2 miles upstream, Frank Patterson added. Henderson mentioned it once, said it was only usable during low water. It was their best chance, but it would require them to move immediately. Garrett's men were closing fast, and every minute of delay reduced their chances of reaching the ford before being overtaken. "We go now," Jake decided. "Everyone mount up. Elena, you and Frank lead the way to the ford. Carlos and Miguel watch our back trail. Whitman and I will cover the flanks." As they prepared to leave the ruined trading post, Cass made a discovery that would haunt them for miles. Hidden in the remains of Henderson's living quarters, she found the body of a young Apache woman, partially burned, but clearly showing signs of torture before death. "They didn't just kill Henderson," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "They tortured this woman to death, probably to make him talk." The discovery revealed the true nature of their pursuers. This wasn't just about law enforcement or bounty money anymore. Garrett and his men had become something far worse. A vigilante death squad that would use any means necessary to achieve their goals. "All the more reason to get out of here," Jake said grimly, helping Cass mount her horse. "Men who would do this won't hesitate to do worse." They rode hard toward the upstream ford, pushing their horses to the limit across terrain that seemed designed to break both man and beast. Behind them, the dust cloud of their pursuers grew steadily larger, and the sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as Garrett's men discovered the empty trading post. The ford, when they finally reached, it was both better and worse than they had hoped. The water level was indeed low enough to attempt a crossing, but the recent flood had left the bottom treacherous, with shifting sand and hidden debris. Worse, the approaches on both sides were narrow and easily defended, meaning that if they were caught in the middle of the crossing, they would be helpless targets. "It's going to have to be all or nothing," Jake announced. "We cross together fast as we can and hope we make it before they catch up." Theodore Whitman checked his weapons one final time, then looked back toward the dust cloud that marked their pursuers' approach. "Jake, there's something I need to tell you before we do this." "What?" "If we don't make it across, if Garrett captures us, I want you to know that these past weeks riding with you and your people have been the most honest I've felt in years. Whatever happens, I'm glad I chose this side." Jake studied the former federal marshal's face, looking for any sign of deception. What he saw instead was a man who had found something worth dying for after years of enforcing laws he no longer believed in. "Theodore Whitman died in the desert," Jake said firmly. "Tom Whitmore is going to live to see California." "Tom Whitmore," the man repeated, as if testing how the name felt. "I like the sound of that." The first shots rang out from the canyon. As Garrett's advance scouts spotted them at the ford. The bullets whined off the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying like deadly rain. "Now or never," Jake shouted over the gunfire. One by one, they plunged their horses into the swift-running Colorado River, fighting against the current and the treacherous footing as bullets whistled overhead. The crossing would determine whether they lived to build new lives in California or died as the people they had been in the unforgiving waters of the frontier. Behind them, Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett watched through his field glasses, his face twisted with the obsessive hatred that had driven him across half the continent. The final confrontation between the lawman and the outlaw was about to begin, played out in the muddy waters of a river that had already claimed the lives of countless others who had dared to seek their fortunes in the American West. The Colorado River's current was stronger than it appeared from the bank, and Cass felt her horse struggling against the pull of the muddy water as bullets continued to whine overhead. Jake rode beside her, his face grim with concentration as he fought to keep both their mounts moving toward the far shore. "Stay low," he shouted over the gunfire and rushing water. "Almost there." Behind them, Frank Patterson's horse stumbled on the treacherous bottom, nearly throwing him into the current. Miguel Santos grabbed the animal's bridle, steadying it, while Frank regained his seat. The mutual dependence that had developed over weeks of shared hardship was now keeping them alive minute by minute. Elena Rodriguez reached the far bank first, her horse scrambling up the rocky slope with desperate strength. She immediately took cover behind a boulder and began returning fire at the canyon rim, buying precious seconds for the others to complete their crossing. "Carlos, get up here," she called to her husband, who was still fighting the current in mid-river. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the eastern approach told them that Garrett's main force was closing fast. Tom Whitmore, he was thinking of himself by that name now, reached the western bank and immediately began helping the others drag their exhausted horses out of the water. "We can't stay here," he warned Jake as the outlaw leader finally reached safety. "This whole area's going to be a killing field once they get positioned." Jake nodded, scanning the terrain ahead. The western side of the river rose in a series of rocky terraces that offered some cover, but they would be exposed during the climb. Beyond that, the land opened into a broad valley that stretched toward distant mountains. California, finally within reach, but still miles away. "Those mountains," Jake said, pointing toward the purple peaks on the horizon. "How far?" 20 miles, maybe 25, Whitmore replied. "But it's a rough country. Our horses are already exhausted and theirs are fresh." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. They had successfully crossed the river, but they were still badly outnumbered and would soon be pursued across open ground. Their only advantage was the time it would take Garrett's men to find their own way across Colorado. "Look," Cass said, pointing back toward the eastern bank. "They're not crossing." Indeed, Garrett's men had stopped at the river's edge and were setting up what appeared to be a more permanent position. Several riders were heading upstream, probably to scout for better crossing points, but the main force seemed content to wait. "They're not stupid," Carlos observed. "Garrett knows we can't go anywhere except west toward those mountains. He's probably sending men around to cut us off while he crosses at a safer point." It was classic military tactics: fix the enemy in place while maneuvering for advantage. Garrett might be corrupt, but he was also an experienced soldier who understood how to use terrain and superior numbers. Frank Patterson had been studying the pursuit through his field glasses, and what he saw was even more troubling. "There are more men coming from the south. Looks like another 10 or 12 riders." "The other bounty hunters," Whitmore said grimly. "Garrett must have coordinated with them. They've got us bracketed." The net was closing from multiple directions, and their window of escape was shrinking rapidly. Jake made a command decision that would determine their fate. "We split up," he announced. "Elena and Carlos head north toward those rock formations. Frank and Miguel go south toward that dry wash. Tom and I will take Cass straight west toward the mountains." "No," Carlos protested immediately. "We stay together. We've come this far as a group, and if we stay together, we'll all die together," Jake replied firmly. 3 small groups have a better chance than one large one. At least some of us might make it." It was a painful decision, but the logic was undeniable. Elena Rodriguez understood, immediately embracing Cass quickly before mounting her horse. "If we don't see each other again," Elena said, "remember that you're stronger than you think. You've already survived more than most people could imagine." The farewells were brief but emotional. These people had become family during their journey, bound together by shared dangers and common purpose. Now they were separating possibly forever, with nothing but hope that some of them would survive to build the new lives they had dreamed of. As the 3 groups rode in different directions, Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett watched from across the river with satisfaction. He had anticipated that Morrison would split his forces when cornered, and he was prepared for it. His own men were already moving to intercept each group, and he had positioned his strongest riders to pursue Morrison himself. "Fletcher," Garrett called to the merchant who had guided them this far. "You know this country. Where would Morrison go if he's heading for those mountains?" Samuel Fletcher studied the terrain with the practiced eye of a man who had traveled these routes for years. There's an old mining trail that runs through Devil's Canyon. It's the fastest way into the high country, but it's dangerous. Lot of men have died trying to make that climb. Perfect, Garrett said with grim satisfaction. Morrison will think the danger will discourage pursuit. He's wrong. Meanwhile, Jake, Cass, and Tom Whitmore were riding hard across the valley floor, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that would be visible for miles. The mountains that had seemed so close from the river now appeared impossibly distant, shimmering in the afternoon heat, like a mirage. "How much of a head start do we have?" Cass asked, looking back toward the river crossing. "Not enough," Jake replied honestly. "Maybe an hour before Garrett gets across and starts a serious pursuit." Tom Whitmore was studying the approaching terrain. With growing concern, "Jake, there's something about this valley that bothers me. It's too perfect. Open ground with no cover, mountains that funnel toward a single pass. If I were setting up an ambush—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Jake was already seeing the same tactical problem. The valley was a natural trap, designed to channel fleeing fugitives toward a predetermined killing ground in the foothills. "You think they've got men already positioned in the mountains?" Jake asked. "I'd bet my life on it," Whitmore replied. "This whole chase has been too well coordinated to be improvised. Garrett's been planning this for weeks." As if to confirm their worst fears, the afternoon sun glinted off metal in the distant rocks ahead, the unmistakable flash of rifle barrels being positioned. They were riding directly into a carefully prepared ambush. "So what do we do?" Cass asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Jake considered their options. Turning back would mean riding directly into Garrett's pursuit. Going north or south would expose them to the other bounty hunting parties. Continuing forward meant facing whatever trap awaited in the mountains. "We do what they don't expect," Jake decided. "We don't run from the ambush. We attack it." It was a desperate gamble, but it was also tactically sound. The men waiting in the rocks would be positioned to shoot fleeing fugitives, not to defend against a frontal assault. If Jake's small group could get close enough, they might be able to turn the ambush into a firefight on more equal terms. "There," Whitmore said, pointing toward a dry stream bed that angled toward the foothills. "If we follow that wash, we can get within rifle range without being seen." They changed course immediately, guiding their exhausted horses into the rocky channel that would provide cover for their approach. The wash was treacherous, filled with loose stones and hidden obstacles, but it offered their only chance of reaching the ambush position undetected. As they worked their way closer to the mountains, they could hear voices echoing off the canyon. Walls, the casual conversation of men who thought they held all the advantages. Jake counted at least 6 different speakers, possibly more hidden in positions they couldn't see. "Remember," Jake whispered as they prepared for their assault, "we're not trying to win this fight. We're just trying to create enough confusion to break through their line." Tom Whitmore checked his weapons one final time, his face showing the calm determination of a man who had made peace with his choices. "Whatever happens, I want you both to know it's been an honor." "Save the speeches for later," Jake replied with a tight smile. "We're not dead yet." They emerged from the wash at a dead run, their horses laboring up the rocky slope toward the hidden riflemen. The element of surprise worked perfectly for the first few seconds. Several shots went wild as the ambushers tried to adjust their aim for targets coming from an unexpected direction. But 6 rifles against 3 was still overwhelming odds, and the defensive position was well chosen. Within moments, bullets were ricocheting off the rocks around them, and Tom Whitmore's horse stumbled and went down, throwing him hard against a boulder. "Tom!" Cass shouted, seeing him fall. "Keep going!" Whitmore called back, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "I'll catch up." But they all knew he wouldn't. His horse was dead, and he was on foot in open ground with armed men closing in from multiple directions. Jake faced an impossible choice: abandon the man who had risked everything to help them, or try to save him and doom all 3 of them. The decision was taken out of his hands when Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett appeared on the ridge above them, his rifle trained directly on Cass. "That's far enough, Morrison," Garrett called down, "unless you want to watch your woman die the same way she almost died in Millfield." Jake reined in his horse, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. But Garrett had positioned himself perfectly, with clear shots at both Cass and the wounded Whitmore. "Let them go, Garrett," Jake shouted back. "This is between you and me." "Nothing's between you and me anymore, Outlaw," Garrett replied. "This is about justice, and justice says all three of you hang for your crimes." "What crimes?" Cass demanded, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Loving someone? Trying to build a life together? If that's a crime, then your law isn't worth following." Garrett's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Your law? There's only one law out there, girl, and that's the gun law. Today I've got more guns than you do." As if to emphasize his point, more armed men appeared on the surrounding ridges. Jake counted at least a dozen rifles pointed in their direction, with more men still climbing into position. The trap was complete, and there seemed to be no way out, but Tom Whitmore had one more card to play. From his position on the ground, hidden behind the body of his dead horse, he still had a clear shot at Garrett. The former federal marshal had spent years perfecting his marksmanship, and the distance was well within his range. "Garrett," Whitmore called out, drawing the deputy marshal's attention. "Remember what you said about the gun?" Garrett turned toward the voice, and in that moment of distraction, Whitmore took his shot. The bullet caught Garrett in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering down the rocky slope. "Now!" Jake shouted, spurring his horse toward the gap in the ambush line. The next few seconds were chaos. Rifles cracked from multiple directions as Garrett's men tried to stop the escape while avoiding hitting their wounded leader. Jake and Cass rode through a storm of lead, their horses leaping over rocks and dodging between boulders in a desperate flight toward freedom. Behind them, Tom Whitmore fought his last battle, using his rifle with deadly precision to cover their escape. He knew he wouldn't survive the encounter, but he also knew that his sacrifice might give Jake and Cass the chance they needed to reach the high country and disappear into the wilderness beyond. As they created the ridge and began their descent into the labyrinth of canyons that marked the true beginning of the Sierra Nevada mountains, Jake looked back once to see Tom Whitmore make his final stand. The man who had been Theodore Whitman, federal marshal, died as Tom Whitmore, friend and ally, his last act one of redemption rather than law enforcement. "He saved us," Cass said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "He saved himself too," Jake replied. "In the end, he became the man he wanted to be." The mountains ahead were vast and wild, offering both sanctuary and new dangers, but for the first time since leaving Texas, Jake Morrison and Cassandra Williams were truly free. Free from pursuit, free from their past, and free to become whoever they chose to be in the untamed wilderness of California. 20 years had passed since that fateful day in Millfield, Texas, when a rope had been placed around Cassandra Williams's neck for the crime of loving Jake Morrison. The woman who now stood before the ornate mirror in the governor's mansion in Sacramento bore little resemblance to that frightened girl who had once faced a hangman's noose. Catherine Wilson, First Lady of California, adjusted the pearls at her throat and smoothed the elegant blue silk gown that had been crafted by the finest dressmakers in San Francisco. Tonight was the inaugural ball celebrating her husband's election as the second governor of the newly admitted state of California, and representatives from across the nation had gathered to witness this historic moment. Governor James Wilson stood behind her, struggling with his formal collar in a way that reminded her of the man who had once been more comfortable in trail clothes and gun leather. His dark hair was now touched with silver at the temples, and his face showed the lines that came from years of carrying the weight of public responsibility. But his eyes still held the same intensity that had captivated her in that general store so many years ago. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" he said, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "From wanted outlaws to the governor's mansion." "Sometimes I wonder if we're dreaming," Catherine replied, turning to face him. "But then I remember all the work it took to get here, all the people who believed in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves. The path from Sheriff of Redemption Creek to Governor of California had been neither straight nor easy. James Wilson's reputation as an innovative lawman had attracted the attention of state political leaders who recruited him to run for the territorial legislature. His common-sense approach to complex problems and his ability to bridge divides between different factions had made him a natural choice for higher office. Catherine's own influence had been equally important. Her work in education reform had gained national recognition, and her advocacy for women's rights and social justice had made her a powerful political figure in her own right. Together, they had campaigned on a platform of second chances, economic opportunity, and honest government that resonated with California's diverse population. The irony was not lost on either of them that Jake Morrison, who had once robbed banks because he saw them as symbols of corruption, was now working to regulate those same institutions as governor. The difference was that Governor Wilson understood both sides of the equation. He knew how easily legitimate business could slide into exploitation, and he knew how desperation could drive good people to make terrible choices. A soft knock at the door interrupted their reflections. Rebecca Morrison Anderson entered, resplendent in emerald green silk that complemented her graying auburn hair. At 52, Jake's sister had become one of Sacramento's most influential social reformers, using her husband's banking connections to fund schools, hospitals, and programs for the disadvantaged. "The receiving line is forming," Rebecca announced. "Are you ready to meet your public, Governor Wilson?" "As ready as I'll ever be," James replied, offering his arm to Catherine. "Though I still think it's strange that people want to shake hands with a man who used to be on the other side of the law." "That's exactly why they want to shake your hand," Rebecca said with a smile. "You represent the possibility of redemption. The idea that America really is a place where anyone can start over and make something better of themselves." The grand ballroom of the governor's mansion was filled with dignitaries from across the country. Senators and congressmen mingled with railroad barons and cattle ranchers, while their wives discussed the latest fashions from New York and Paris. But scattered throughout the crowd were faces that meant more to the new governor than any political luminary. Carlos and Elena Rodriguez had traveled from Redemption Creek, where Carlos now served as mayor of what had become one of California's most prosperous mountain communities. Elena wore the confident bearing of a woman who had helped shape that prosperity through her work establishing cooperative businesses and women's organizations. Martha Henderson, the baker who had once defended the Wilsons against Samuel Fletcher's accusations, was now a successful restaurant owner in San Francisco. Dr. Sarah Chen had become the state's first Chinese-American physician to be licensed by the medical board, a breakthrough that owed much to Governor Wilson's support for inclusive professional standards. Even Pete Mulligan, the gruff former cavalry sergeant, had cleaned up remarkably well for the occasion. His livery stable had grown into one of California's largest horse-breeding operations, and his granddaughter was among the first students to benefit from the Wilsons' education reforms. As the evening progressed, Governor Wilson found himself in conversation with a newspaper correspondent from New York, who was writing a feature story about the new state's leadership. "Governor, there are persistent rumors about your background before arriving in California," the reporter said carefully. "Some suggest you lived under a different name, perhaps even had encounters with the law. How do you respond to such speculation?" It was the question James had been expecting for years, and he had long since decided how to answer it. "I respond by pointing to my record of public service," he said calmly. I respond by noting that California is a state built by people who came here seeking new opportunities and fresh starts. I respond by saying that what matters is not who a man was 20 years ago, but who he chooses to be today. But surely, the public has a right to know. The public has a right to honest, competent governance, Catherine interjected smoothly, joining the conversation. My husband has provided that as sheriff, as legislator, and now as governor. His past has informed his judgment, not compromised it. The reporter pressed for more details, but Governor Wilson had learned the art of political deflection. He smoothly changed the subject to California's economic development plans, leaving the journalist with plenty of material, but no scandalous revelations. Later, as the ball wound down and the last guests departed, James and Catherine stood on the mansion's balcony, looking out over the city that had become their home. Gas lamps flickered in the streets below, and the Sacramento River gleamed in the moonlight as it flowed toward San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean beyond. "Do you think we'll ever be able to tell the whole truth?" Catherine asked quietly. "Maybe," James replied. "Maybe when enough time has passed that Jake Morrison and Cassandra Williams seem like characters in a dime novel rather than real people who might still face consequences. And if someone does uncover the truth before then?" James considered the question seriously. "Then we face it together, the same way we faced everything else. The difference is, now we have an entire state of people who know us as James and Catherine Wilson, who've seen what we've accomplished, who understand that redemption is real." A carriage clattered past on the street below, its wheels echoing off the brick buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, marking the end of Inauguration Day and the beginning of a new chapter in California's history. "I love you, James Wilson," Catherine said, using the name that had become more real to her than the one she was born with. "I love you too, Catherine Wilson," he replied, pulling her close. "Mrs. Governor." They had traveled an impossible distance. From that dusty gallows in Millfield, Texas, they had proven that love could indeed triumph over law, that second chances were more than just romantic fantasies, and that the American promise of reinvention was real for those brave enough to seize it. The wanted posters had long since crumbled to dust. The corrupt lawmen who had pursued them were dead or forgotten. Even the scars from those desperate years had faded, replaced by the confidence that came from building something lasting and good. But perhaps most remarkably, they had transformed not just themselves, but everyone around them. Redemption Creek had become a beacon of hope for others seeking fresh starts. Their advocacy for prison reform and rehabilitation had influenced legislation throughout the West. Their own marriage had become a symbol of love's power to overcome any obstacle. As they prepared to return inside, Catherine paused at the balcony railing, her hand resting over her heart, where a small locket held a pressed flower from their wedding day in Redemption Creek 20 years before. "What are you thinking about?" James asked. "About that girl who stood on a gallows platform and refused to apologize for loving you," Catherine replied. "I want her to know that it was worth it. Every danger we faced, every mile we traveled, every night we spent wondering if we'd see another sunrise, it was all worth it to get to this moment." Governor James Wilson looked at his wife, the First Lady of California, the woman who had chosen love over safety and had somehow helped them both find their way to a life beyond anything they had dared to dream. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove that their transformation was real and lasting. But tonight, they were simply James and Catherine Wilson, standing together under the California stars, grateful for a journey that had tested everything they were and revealed everything they could become. They had tried to hang her for loving an outlaw. Instead, that love had built an empire of hope, redemption, and second chances that would outlast them both. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.